Long before satellites, smartphones, or even steam engines, there was a small group of people living on a chain of islands in the middle of the South Pacific. They weren't famous. They didn't trade with empires or appear on any explorer's maps. They simply lived fishing, farming, singing songs to the sea, and telling stories under star-filled skies. Their lives moved with the rhythm of the tides and the seasons, quiet but full. Then in the late 1700s, everything changed in a single night. It started with the ground trembling, a low, deep groan that made birds flee from the trees. The volcano at the heart of their main island, long thought to be sleeping, woke up with terrifying force. Ash blotted out the sun. The earth cracked open, and soon after, the ocean itself seemed to turn against them. A wall of water, higher than the tallest palm tree, swept across the coast, swallowing villages whole. Most didn't survive, but a few did. Less than 200 souls, mostly women, children, and elders, managed to scramble up the steep slopes into the island's rugged interior. They carried nothing but the clothes on their backs, a few clay pots, and the memory of what had been lost. The coastline was gone, buried under rock and mud. Their canoes, their temples, their burial grounds all vanished. Cut off from the sea, they couldn't fish like before. Cut off from other islands, they couldn't trade or ask for help. And worst of all, they were cut off from the outside world entirely. No ships passed by. No maps marked their new hiding place. They were alone. At first, they tried to keep their old ways alive. They sang the old songs. They repeated the names of ancestors. They taught the children the words for rain, for breadfruit, for love. But grief has a way of stealing voices. One by one, people stopped speaking, not because they forgot how, but because every word reminded them of someone who was gone. The sound of their language began to feel like an echo in an empty house. So slowly, they turned to other ways of sharing what mattered. A tap on the shoulder meant follow me. A certain pattern of woven leaves told a story of the great wave. A dance performed at dawn showed how the stars moved across the sky. Their communication didn't disappear, it just changed shape. They learned to listen with their eyes, not just their ears. Years turned into decades. The children who had once heard the old tongue grew old themselves, and their grandchildren knew only silence and gesture. The language didn't die all at once. It faded like a footprint in the sand, washed away by time and sorrow. Still, they remembered, not in words, but in how they planted crops in spirals that mirrored ocean currents, or how they never wasted a single drop of rainwater. Their knowledge lived in their hands, their movements, their choices. Meanwhile, far away, the rest of the world moved on. Explorers came to the islands decades later, looking for spices, slaves, or scientific discovery. They found ruins, broken walls, overgrown paths, strange carvings half buried in soil. But no people, no voices, no signs of life. They assumed the islanders had all perished in the disaster. Maps labeled the place abandoned. Scholars wrote papers calling it a tragic footnote in Pacific history. And so the silence of the island became a fact in textbooks. The people of this island vanished in the late 18th century, but they hadn't vanished. They'd just gone quiet. Deep in the Highland Valley, shielded by mist and thick jungle, life continued. They built new homes from bamboo and thatch. They domesticated wild yams and bred hardy chickens that could survive on little. They marked time not by calendars, but by the blooming of a certain flower or the return of a rare bird. They had no clocks, no money, no governments, but they had community. They looked after each other. When someone fell ill, others gathered to hum healing tunes. When a child was born, the whole village wove a blanket stitched with symbols of protection. They didn't think of themselves as lost. To them, they were exactly where they needed to be, safe, hidden, and together. And so, generation after generation passed in this quiet rhythm. The outside world invented trains, then radios, then computers. Wars were fought. Cities rose and fell. But in that hidden valley, the only news came from the wind, the rain, and the stories passed down through touch and motion. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, just not the kind the rest of the world could hear. By the early 1800s, the last person who could speak the old language fluently had passed away. But her granddaughter remembered the lullaby she used to sing, the rise and fall of her voice, the way her hands moved like waves. That granddaughter taught her own children to mimic those sounds, not as words, but as comfort. And so fragments of speech survived, not as conversation but as feeling. For 250 years, no outsider set foot in their valley. No microphone recorded their voices. No camera captured their faces. To the rest of humanity, they simply didn't exist. And maybe in a way they preferred it that way. After all, the world that had once ignored their warnings about the volcano, that had never come to help after the tsunami, why would they trust it now? But silence can't last forever. Not when the world keeps changing. Not when trees fall and drones fly overhead. Not when a young person, born into quiet, starts wondering what lies beyond the ridge. And that's exactly what happened, 2.5 centuries later, when curiosity finally broke the silence. But that's another part of the story. For now, it's enough to know this. They were never gone. They were just waiting, watching, remembering. And in their silence, they held on to something precious, not just survival, but dignity, care, and a way of living in harmony with the earth that the noisy world outside had long forgotten. The island didn't stay silent because it had nothing to say. It stayed silent because no one was listening. And when someone finally did, everything changed. While the islanders lived quietly in their hidden valley, the rest of the world kept spinning, faster and louder with every passing year. Empires rose and crumbled. Trains whistled across continents. Wars were fought with weapons no one had dreamed of before. People learned to talk across oceans through wires, then through invisible signals in the air. Cities grew so tall they blocked out the stars. And through it all, the outside world never once thought about the small group of people tucked away in that misty Pacific Valley. To everyone else, they were already gone, wiped out by fire and water, lost to time. Scholars in faraway universities sometimes mentioned them in lectures, calling them a cautionary tale of nature's power. School children read short paragraphs about the vanished islanders and moved on to the next chapter. No one imagined that deep in the jungle, children were still being born, elders were still sharing wisdom, and life, slow, careful, and deeply connected, was still unfolding. The islanders didn't know about electricity or airplanes or the internet. They didn't need to. Their world was small, but it was complete. They watched the clouds to know when rain would come. They read the behavior of birds to find ripe fruit. They knew which plants healed fevers and which roots could be stored for months. Their knowledge wasn't written in books. It lived in their hands, their eyes, their daily routines. As generations passed, they adapted in quiet, clever ways. When the old crops failed, they found new ones in the wild and tamed them. When storms damaged their homes, they rebuilt with stronger designs, using vines as rope and layered leaves as roofing. They never wasted anything. A broken pot became a seed tray. A worn-out mat became kindling. Even fallen leaves were gathered and layered into rich soil for planting. Their communication stayed mostly wordless, but rich with meaning. A certain tilt of the head meant danger ahead. A specific rhythm of clapping during a gathering signaled a decision had been made. Their woven textiles told stories. Zigzag lines for lightning, circles for the moon, spirals for journeys. Newcomers to the valley, like babies or those who married in, learned this language not through lessons, but by living alongside others, watching, copying, feeling. And yet, they never forgot they were once part of something bigger. On special nights, the elders would gather the community around a fire and perform the memory dance. It wasn't just entertainment, it was history. Through movement, they showed the Great Wave, the climb to the highlands, the planting of the first garden in the valley. Children watched wide-eyed, absorbing the story in their bones. No words were spoken, but everyone understood. This is who we are. This is how we survived. Outside, the world changed in ways they couldn't imagine. Ships with metal hulls replaced wooden sails. Satellites began circling the Earth, snapping photos of every forest, desert, and ocean. Scientists mapped the planet down to the last square meter. But somehow their valley stayed hidden. Thick clouds clung to the mountaintops year-round. Dense jungle choked the lower slopes. And the island itself was far from major shipping lanes. It was as if the Earth itself was protecting them. Still, the outside world crept closer. Logging companies cut down forests on nearby islands. Fishing fleets dragged nets through coral reefs. Plastic waste began washing up on even the most remote beaches. Climate change made storms stronger, droughts longer, and sea levels rise. Researchers came to the region more often, not to find people, but to study rare birds, disappearing frogs, or the effects of warming oceans. Sometimes, these scientists camped on the outer edges of the main island. They set up cameras, collected soil samples, and flew drones over the interior to map untouched ecosystems. The islanders saw these drones, strange buzzing insects with blinking lights, and stayed hidden. They'd learned long ago that strangers often brought trouble, so they watched from behind trees, stayed downwind, and never left tracks. But curiosity is human, and it runs both ways. While the world forgot them, some of the younger islanders began to wonder, what's out there? They'd find strange objects washed ashore, bottles with paper inside, metal cans with colorful pictures, pieces of cloth that didn't rot like natural fibers. They'd examine them carefully, then store them away like sacred relics. These weren't trash to them, they were messages from another world. Still, the elders urged caution. The outside is loud, they'd gesture, hands moving like crashing waves. It takes more than it gives. And so, the community stayed put, trusting the old ways, honoring the silence that had kept them safe for so long. Meanwhile, in universities and museums, a few linguists kept the islanders' memory alive. Not as ghosts, but as a mystery. They studied the few carvings and artifacts collected centuries ago. They compared the symbols to other Pacific languages, trying to crack a code that no one had spoken in 200 years. Some believed the language was gone forever. Others held out hope that somewhere, somehow, a trace remained. But without proof, it was just theory. And theories don't feed people or heal wounds. Back in the valley, life went on. A baby was born during a full moon. An elder passed away peacefully, wrapped in a blanket woven by their grandchildren. A new type of sweet potato was discovered, sweeter and heartier than any before. These were the real events, the ones that mattered to them. Not wars or inventions, but the quiet miracles of daily survival. And yet the world was closing in. Not with armies or loud announcements, but with heat, with rising tides, with the slow unraveling of nature's balance. The islanders noticed changes too. The fruit ripened earlier, the rains came later, some birds didn't return in spring. They adjusted as they always had, but even they could sense that something big was shifting, not just on their island, but everywhere. They didn't know it yet, but their silence wouldn't last much longer. The same forces that were changing the climate were also pushing scientists deeper into untouched places, searching for answers, for hope, for solutions. And soon, those searchers would stumble upon more than just rare plants or clean water. They'd find people. People who hadn't spoken a word the outside world could understand in 250 years, but who held knowledge that might help save the very world that had forgotten them. For now, though, the valley remained still. Mist curled around the treetops. Children played with carved wooden birds. Elders watched the sky, reading signs in the clouds. And the silence, deep, patient, and full of unspoken truth, continued. But silence, like everything else, has its season. And theirs was about to end. It started with a flower. Not a loud explosion or a dramatic rescue, just a rare orchid. Pale blue and shaped like a star, growing in a part of the island no scientist had ever documented. A small team of researchers had come to the region to study how certain plants were surviving, despite rising temperatures and changing rainfall. They weren't looking for people. They were looking for hope in roots and petals, in the quiet resilience of nature. But nature has a way of leading us where we need to go. While hiking through thick undergrowth near the island's center, one of the botanists noticed something strange. The ground was too neat. Fallen branches were stacked in orderly piles. Certain trees had strips of bark carefully peeled in patterns that didn't look random. And then, carved into a moss-covered stone half hidden by ferns, were symbols, curved lines, dots, spirals, that matched old sketches from 18th century explorer journals. The team froze. These weren't natural markings. Someone had made them, recently. At first, they thought it might be a hoax. Maybe another research group had left clues as a joke. But the deeper they went, the clearer it became. This place was tended. Trails barely visible wound through the jungle. Banana plants grew in neat rows. And high above, where the canopy opened just enough, they spotted smoke. A thin, steady curl rising from a hidden valley. They didn't rush in. They knew better. Instead, they set up camp far away and watched. Days passed. Nothing moved. Then one morning, a drone they'd sent to map the treetops captured something unexpected. A figure, small and quick, darting between trees. Not wearing modern clothes. Moving like someone who knew every root and rock, back in the valley, life had already begun to shift. The younger ones had seen the drones, those strange buzzing birds with glass eyes. At first, they'd been scared, but curiosity grew stronger than fear. One of them, a young person who'd always asked questions no one could answer, "What's beyond the ridge? Do others live like us?" decided to find out. One quiet dawn, while the mist still clung to the ground, they slipped past the outer watchposts and climbed toward the sound of the buzzing. They didn't carry weapons, just a small woven pouch with food and a piece of cloth stitched with family symbols, a way to say, "I come in peace." They didn't know what they'd find. Maybe monsters, maybe ghosts, maybe nothing at all. Instead, they found a person kneeling by a stream, carefully placing a net over a rare orchid. The outsider looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. One didn't know the words. The other didn't expect any, but something passed between them anyway. The islander crouched slowly, showing empty hands. Then with gentle movements, they tapped their chest, pointed to the sky, then mimed planting a seed. It wasn't a sentence, but it was a beginning. The researcher, heart pounding, reached into their pack and offered a piece of dried fruit. The islander accepted it, then pulled out their woven cloth and laid it on the ground. That cloth told a story. Not with letters, but with colors and shapes. A wave, a mountain, a circle of people holding hands. The researcher didn't understand it all, but they understood enough. This wasn't an abandoned island. It was a home. Word spread fast, but quietly. The research team contacted their university, then local authorities, then cultural preservation groups. No helicopters, no cameras, no rush. They agreed this had to be handled with care. These people hadn't survived 250 years of silence just to be turned into a spectacle. Over the next few weeks, trust grew slowly, like a vine reaching for sunlight. The islander returned often, bringing others, first just one or two, then small groups. They watched as the outsider showed pictures of the ocean, of cities, of children in other lands. In return, they showed how to purify water using charcoal and sand, how to predict storms by watching ants, how to grow food without poisoning the soil. Linguists joined the team, not to teach language, but to listen. They recorded gestures, rhythms, sounds that weren't quite words but carried meaning. They noticed that certain hums matched the pitch of bird calls, that hand movements followed the flow of rivers. This wasn't a broken language. It was a different kind of speech, shaped by centuries of quiet observation. Using new technology, they fed these patterns into programs designed to find connections between lost and living languages. Slowly, pieces began to fit. A hand motion for rain matched an old Polynesian word for sky tears. A woven symbol for ancestor looked almost identical to carvings found on a temple fragment from 1780. The language hadn't disappeared, it had transformed, hidden in plain sight. But the real breakthrough came not from machines, but from a moment of shared emotion. One evening, as a storm rolled in, the islanders began a soft, rhythmic chant, not with words but with breath and beat. The outsiders sat quietly listening. Then one of the elders stood and sang a single line, a real word, clear and trembling. Manai. It meant remember. Tears filled the eyes of the linguist who recognized it. It was a word from a language thought dead for centuries, and it was alive. From that night on, the silence began to lift, not all at once, but like fog burning off in morning sun. The islanders started speaking again, not to replace their gestures, but to add another layer. They practiced old words like relearning a song. Children giggled as they tried to say fish or sun, the way their great-great-grandparents might have. The elders wept, not from sadness, but from relief. Their voices, buried for generations, were finally being heard, and the world, for the first time in 250 years, was listening. No one shouted. No one claimed discovery like it was a trophy. Instead, there was humility. The outsiders realized they weren't rescuing anyone. They were being given a gift, a chance to learn from people who had lived in balance with the earth while the rest of humanity burned through resources like there was no tomorrow. This wasn't just about language. It was about a different way of being human, and as the first full sentences were exchanged, halting, emotional, full of wonder, everyone knew something huge had shifted. Not just for the islanders, but for everyone, because when a voice returns after centuries of silence, it doesn't just speak words. It speaks truth. And sometimes that truth is exactly what the world needs to hear. The day the first full sentence was spoken in the old language, clear, strong, and meant for the world to hear, wasn't marked by fanfare or flashing lights. It happened in a simple clearing, under a sky heavy with rain clouds, with only a handful of people present. But it echoed farther than anyone imagined. One of the younger islanders, who had spent weeks practicing with the linguists, stood before a small group that included researchers, local island leaders, and a representative from an international cultural organization. They took a deep breath, looked not at the ground but straight ahead and said, "We did not disappear. We waited." Those 6 words carried the weight of 250 years. There was silence for a moment, not the old silence of hiding, but a new kind of quiet, full of awe. Then someone began to clap, then another. Soon everyone was clapping, not out of politeness but out of respect, because in those words, the world finally understood. This wasn't a discovery. It was a homecoming. News spread fast, but this time, carefully. The team made sure the islanders had control over how their story was told. No sensational headlines, no staged photos. No one was pushed to speak before they were ready. Instead, videos were shared with permission, showing hands weaving, feet, walking familiar paths, elders teaching children how to say thank you in their reborn tongue. People around the world watched, not with curiosity alone, but with something deeper. Humility. Soon, offers came pouring in, help with medicine, clean water, education. But the islanders didn't ask for handouts. What they offered in return surprised everyone. Knowledge. They showed how they grew food without chemicals, using companion planting that kept pests away and soil rich. They explained how they stored rainwater in layered pits lined with clay and charcoal, clean, cool, and lasting through dry seasons. They shared songs that mapped the stars not for navigation, but for knowing when certain fish would return or when fruits would ripen. This wasn't just tradition, it was science, refined over centuries of living close to the earth. Scientists listened. Climate experts took notes. Farmers from drought-stricken regions asked questions. For the first time in a long time, ancient wisdom wasn't dismissed as old ways. It was seen as a lifeline. Then came the invitation to speak at the United Nations. It wasn't a grand speech by a politician or a celebrity. It was a quiet moment, broadcast live to millions. The same young islander who had first met the botanist stood at the podium in a simple woven tunic, barefoot, holding a small carved wooden bird. They didn't read from notes, they spoke from memory and from the heart. We stayed silent, they said, voice steady, because no one was listening. But the earth never stopped speaking. It told us how to heal, how to share, how to live without taking more than we needed. Now we speak, not to be saved, but to remind you. You still have time to listen too. The room fell still. Then, slowly, people stood. Not just diplomats, but scientists, teachers, young activists. They weren't just applauding words. They were acknowledging a truth the modern world had forgotten. That progress doesn't always mean building more, buying more, burning more. Sometimes it means returning to what works. Back home, life in the valley began to change, not because they wanted to become like the outside world, but because they chose how to connect with it. A small solar panel was installed to power a radio, so they could hear weather warnings. A few tablets were brought in loaded with language apps to help children practice speaking. But there were rules. No phones during meals. No screens during storytelling time. Technology was a tool, not a replacement for presence. Schools and other countries started asking to learn the islanders' language, not as a museum piece but as a living one. Linguists worked with elders to create a simple writing system, not to replace weaving or dance, but to help preserve sounds that might otherwise fade again. Children on the island began teaching their language to visiting students through games, songs, and shared meals. Language wasn't just about words anymore. It was about connection. And something beautiful happened. The islanders began to heal, not just from the trauma of the past, but from the loneliness of being forgotten. For generations, they'd carried the quiet burden of being unseen. Now when they spoke, people leaned in. When they shared a remedy made from forest leaves, doctors took it seriously. When they warned about overfishing or cutting down trees too fast, governments listened. UNESCO declared their language and way of life a living heritage of humanity, not as something fragile to be locked away, but as something alive, growing, and worth protecting. Funds were set aside, not to modernize them, but to support what they already did well: sustainable farming, natural medicine, community care. But the biggest change wasn't in policies or programs. It was in hearts. People around the world started looking at their own lives differently. A farmer in Kenya tried the islanders' crop rotation method. A teacher in Canada began starting class with a moment of quiet listening, like the islanders did at dawn. A city planner in Europe redesigned a park using the islanders' idea of useful beauty, plants that feed, heal, and please the eye all at once. The islanders never claimed to have all the answers. They simply reminded everyone that answers exist. If we're willing to slow down, pay attention, and respect the wisdom of those who've lived gently on this earth for a very long time. And through it all, they remained themselves. They still woke with the sun, still shared meals from a common pot, still told stories with their hands as much as their voices. The outside world hadn't changed them. It had just given them a chance to be seen. Now, when someone asks what happened after they spoke, the answer isn't just about language returning. It's about trust being rebuilt, about knowledge flowing both ways, about a small group of people, once thought lost, helping the whole world remember what it means to belong, not just to a place, but to each other and to the earth that holds us all. And in that remembering, everything truly began to change. Years passed, and the world didn't magically fix itself, but something quieter, deeper began to shift. It wasn't in headlines or grand announcements. It was in classrooms where children learned to say thank you in a language once thought gone forever. It was in community gardens where people planted crops not just for yield, but for balance, following patterns taught by islanders who'd never seen a tractor. It was in the way strangers started listening a little longer, speaking a little softer, and asking, "What can we learn from those who've lived well with less?" The islanders didn't become celebrities. They never wanted to. But they became teachers not by standing on stages, but by living their truth. They welcomed small groups of students, farmers, and healers into their valley, not as tourists, but as guests. Visitors slept in simple huts, ate meals cooked over open fires, and learned that time isn't something to be filled, but something to be shared. Many left with calloused hands, full hearts, and a new understanding that real wealth isn't measured in money, but in connection, to land, to community, to purpose. Back in the valley, life stayed rooted. The islanders kept their rhythms, planting with the moon, harvesting with gratitude, resting when the body asked for it. But now they also shared their knowledge beyond the ridge. They helped design water systems for dry villages using their ancient filtration methods. They worked with scientists to protect coral reefs by reviving old fishing limits, only taking what was needed, never during breeding seasons. Their way of life, once hidden for survival, became a model for resilience in a world facing climate chaos. Schools around the globe began including their story and lessons, not as a myth, but as a living example. Children didn't just read about them. They practiced their gestures, tried their recipes, and even wove simple patterns that told stories without words. Teachers noticed something surprising. Students paid more attention. Maybe because this wasn't just history, it was hope made real. And the language? It didn't just come back, it grew. New words were added for things like computer or airplane, but they were shaped by the old spirit. Computer became thinking box. Airplane became sky canoe. The language stayed alive because it stayed useful, and because children laughed while learning it. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Most importantly, the islanders reclaimed their place in the human family. They weren't a relic. They weren't a mystery to be solved. They were neighbors, teachers, and friends. When global leaders gathered to talk about saving the planet, they no longer spoke only to scientists and politicians. They also listened to those who'd protected a piece of it for 250 years, without fanfare, without reward, simply because it was right. One of the elders, now very old but sharp-eyed and warm-hearted, once said something that spread far and wide. Earth does not forget. It remembers in roots, in rivers, in the breath between words. That sentence became a kind of mantra for a new movement, one that valued listening over shouting, care over control, and patience over speed. Cities began changing too. Rooftop gardens bloomed in places once covered only in concrete. Schools replaced plastic trays with banana leaves for lunch. Neighborhoods started quiet hours at dawn and dusk, not for silence as emptiness, but for silence as space, to hear birds, wind, and each other. People realized they didn't need to live like the islanders to learn from them. They just needed to slow down enough to notice what was already around them. And the island itself? It became protected not as a museum, but as a living classroom. No big resorts. No cruise ships. Only small, respectful visits guided by the community itself. The profits went straight back into preserving the valley, training young keepers of knowledge, and supporting other indigenous groups fighting to protect their own lands. But the real victory wasn't in policies or programs. It was in the way people began to see themselves, not as separate from nature, but as part of it. A child in a crowded city would look at a potted plant and wonder, "How can I help you grow?" A farmer would pause before spraying chemicals and ask, "What would the old ways do?" A leader would hesitate before cutting down a forest and remember, some silences hold wisdom. The islanders never claimed to have all the answers. They simply reminded the world that answers exist, if we're willing to listen with more than our ears. With our hands, our hearts, our choices. And perhaps the most beautiful change was this. The shame of being forgotten turned into pride in being remembered, not for being discovered, but for enduring. For holding on, for keeping a flame alive in the darkest quiet, just in case the world ever needed its light again. Now when someone stands on that island and looks out at the ocean, they don't see emptiness. They see a story of loss, yes, but also of return, of silence, yes, but also of voice, of survival, yes, but also of sharing. The earth didn't stay silent because it had nothing to say. It stayed silent because it was waiting for someone to listen with respect. And when that finally happened, everything changed, not with a bang, but with a breath, a word, a seed planted in good soil. Today, the language is spoken in homes, schools, and even online forums. Songs once hummed in secret are now sung at global gatherings. Weavings that once told hidden histories hang in museums, not behind glass, but with QR codes that play elders' voices explaining their meaning. But the heart of it all remains in that valley, where children still learn to read the clouds before checking a weather app, where meals begin with gratitude and where silence is still honored, not as absence, but as a space where truth can grow. And so the story didn't end when they spoke. It began again. This time, not in isolation but in connection, not in fear but in trust, not as a whisper lost to time, but as a voice carried forward by all of us who choose to listen, to learn, and to live a little more gently on this shared earth.